Back around the 1600s, many churches had a kind of seat that was in the front of their sanctuary. They called that seat the stool of repentance. The idea was that if someone had committed a sin on a particular Sunday, usually on a Sunday when communion was being celebrated, you would be brought in and made to sit on that stool. And you would sit on the stool of repentance throughout the worship service. And then when the sermon was over, and usually back then, sermons went on for at least an hour or more, you would be asked to get up and speak to the congregation and tell them how sorry you were for your sin. And then after you had spoken, the congregation would take a vote. And in that vote, they would determine whether you were sincere in your apology or not. And if the congregation deemed that you were truly sorry for your sin, you would then be welcomed back into the fellowship of the congregation and be given communion. Back around the 1600s, that was how many churches dealt with sin. Back around the 1600s, that was how many Christians held one another accountable for living the kind of life that Jesus wanted them to be living. And basically, that's what we find here in this passage that we just listened to from the Gospel of Matthew. Guidance as to how to hold one another accountable when it comes to living out our faith. Jesus says here, if someone sins, first take them aside in private and talk with them one-on-one. And if that person listens to you and changes their ways, fantastic. But if that person refuses to listen, Jesus says, then take 2 or 3 other Christians with you so that they can confirm what you're saying and perhaps encourage that person to face up to their sins. If the person still won't listen, Jesus says, then tell the whole church, so that the whole church might encourage that person to change their ways. And if that person still won't listen, Jesus says, then remove that person from your midst and tell them that they are no longer a member of the church. That's pretty strong stuff. But we need to put those instructions into context, because those instructions about discipline and accountability fall within quite a number of Jesus' teachings about forgiveness. The ultimate goal, then, of holding one another accountable for how we live out our faith isn't so that we can then punish and humiliate one another, but instead so that we might find ways to mend the hurts and the broken relationships that keep us apart, and so that we might come together as the church and be an example to the world of what it looks like when people come together to truly live as followers of Jesus. Likewise, according to the Gospel of Matthew, the last thing Jesus wants is for us to be a bunch of whiny complainers who are always going around looking for the faults in other people. Along that line, earlier in Matthew, Jesus says, how is it that you can say to your neighbor, I can see that speck in your eye, but you aren't able to notice that you have a log in your own eye? Or how is it, Jesus says, that you have the audacity to say to your neighbor, here, let me take that speck out of your eye, when you never bother to take that log out of your own eye. In other words, yes, Jesus wants us to hold each other accountable when it comes to living out our faith. But accountability isn't just a matter of getting them to shape up and change their ways. No, it's also a matter of getting us to shape up and change our ways. Almost 20 years ago, at the first church I served in Vanderbilt in northern Westmoreland County, the elders on the church's session debated this very issue. They had a debate about how to hold the members of that congregation accountable for how they were living out their faith. They debated as to what standard to use. And so the elders debated that at length, and eventually one elder suggested, well, why don't we say that we expect our church members to come to worship 52 Sundays a year, unless they're sick or away? Well, guess what? That didn't pass. And so the discussion went on. Well, what about having our members come at least 12 times a year to worship, once a month? No, that was still considered to be too strict. Well, what about 4 times a year, once a season? No. Well, what about twice a year? Once a year? Well, in the end, what they decided was that in order to continue to be a member of that congregation, you either needed to come to worship 1 Sunday a year, or donate at least $1 in the offering plate. For some reason, we seem to have a hard time setting high expectations for ourselves when it comes to living out our faith. But for some strange reason, the church is about the only place where that sort of thing happens. For instance, if you're an adult and you want to join the Rotary Club, what kind of expectations do they have? Will they expect that you are going to show up for all of their weekly meetings? And if you miss any of their meetings, they expect you to make up that absence by attending the meeting of another Rotary Club in the area. And they expect you to take part in their service projects and to contribute generously to their fundraising efforts. And if you fail to live up to any of those expectations, you're out. Try showing up for just 1 or 2 Rotary meetings a year. They won't hesitate to tell you that you're out. They won't hate you, but they'll say that until you really get on board with who they are and what they are about, you shouldn't go around saying that you are a Rotarian. Or if you're a young person and join a soccer team, what kind of expectations do they have? They expect that you're going to show up for the games and the practices. They expect that you're going to study the playbook. They expect that you're going to get yourself into physical shape so that you can play in the games. And if you fail to live up to any of those expectations, you're out. Try telling the coach that you only plan to show up for half the games. The coach won't hesitate to tell you that you're off the team. The coach won't hate you, but he'll tell you until you really get